Spring. I'm Bob Zykowitz. My guest today is Bob Peterson, an intelligence expert in the radio game. And today we're going to discuss what's going on in the Pacific during World War II. Bob, it's nice having you back.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate being here.
About a year ago, you and I were on, and we discussed intelligence in Europe.
Yes.
Can you come up with a synopsis of what is the difference between European electronic intelligence and what we did in the Pacific?
Okay. Well, last time we talked about tactical intelligence, down to the core, the Army group level.
Yeah.
Not so much on the Enigma and the success that the British and partnered with the Americans had against the German Enigma communications in Europe. And for Europe, it was very structured. You had all the different corps and armies and army groups with their own radio intelligence companies. In the Pacific, it was much different. Given the wide area of the Pacific, the islands structure and the distances involved, it was much more spread out, more not necessarily decentralized. They were connected, but a little bit different structure. There weren't as many companies out there, but they did some excellent work.
The first thing that comes to my mind and the difference was that MacArthur, he established his own intelligence group. Whereas in the Pacific, or in the Atlantic, we had Bletchley Park. Even though MacArthur had this group, we still sent our intelligence back to Arlington Hall. Is this correct?
Yes, there was a lot going back to Arlington.
Yeah. This brings up a point in reference to an intelligence find that I'd like to relate, if you don't mind. It seems that Admiral Yamamoto was going to inspect some of his bases in the South Pacific. We, in the United States, intercepted a message which outlined the total Yamamoto itinerary. A U.S. Army pilot, Lamphere, was then given the task to fly his P-38 west and then head east and meet Yamamoto coming down, which he did, and over the jungles of Bougainville, bam, he was shot down. They did it that way because they did not want the Japanese to know that we had the power to decrypt their codes. As a follow-up to that, the Admiral Tojo, not the infamous one in Tokyo, but Admiral Tojo became Yamamoto's successor. And as the Marines island hopped, Tojo decided he was going to move his headquarters from Rabaul to the Philippines. When he did, his plane was involved in a storm and down he went and he was killed. But a beautiful chrysanthemum velvet type attaché case was found floating by two Philippine fishermen. You want to pick up the story from there?
Well, from what I understand, that attaché case made its way back to Australia and to MacArthur's hands and his intelligence group. And so that was a good exploitation for the codes and activities from the Pacific. I mean, that's one of a couple examples. I think a lot of people are familiar with, on the Navy side, the Battle of Midway and how the Navy were able to crack a Japanese code and identify that Midway was the target following Pearl Harbor in early '42.
The Japanese, did they identify their islands by a diagraph of some sort?
They did. Midway was AF.
AF, okay.
And so they did a little deception and they said, well, have Midway report in the clear that their water plant, their water distillation plant was down and that they were hurting. And the Japanese bid on that. They came up on the air and said, hey, AF has got water problems. And that confirmed for the Americans where the Japanese planned to strike next. And they were able to position their carriers in the right spot to the northeast of Midway and basically ambush the Japanese fleet and sink 4 of their carriers. So that was a good turning point in the Pacific. The American Army, a little bit harder work as far as what they were going for. They had a little bit of success using traffic analysis and basically using the call signs and the location information, the time the message was intercepted, and trying to relate that to which units they may be associated with to find out what activity was taking place in certain locations.
Was the first group of an intercepted message, wasn't that critical?
Yes. Yeah.
What, didn't it give a page number, if you will, or what?
It can give an indicator. If you have access to the Japanese codes and you have the indicators, you can identify what key they may be using and then be able to go in and decode a message. Charles Gerhardt, who was MacArthur's lead cryptologist in Australia and followed him all the way up back into Japan, they had a whole section of IBM key punch machines that they used. And so they would try to break into codes that way if they found identifying pieces. And but the preamble with all that information, with the indicator and the call signs and all that information up front, kind of the externals to a message, all that was important, so you could basically use that to track units and what they were up to. Each operator, Japanese operator, had a certain way he would send Morse code, and that operator's identifying fist would also help them identify a particular unit and what was happening. And so by doing that and using a very wide array of direction finding units, basically by the end of the war it was from the Aleutians all the way down the west coast into Hawaii, Guam, New Guinea, all sorts of islands out there, would then be tied into this direction finding net, and they could locate where these units were.
The European theater, specifically the Allies, utilized the Enigma to get into, or they got into the Enigma, but we didn't have that in the Pacific, did we? What was the Japanese code? What was our code word for the Jap code?
Well, Enigma in Europe was called Ultra.
Ultra.
And in the Pacific with the Japanese code, and more of the diplomatic level, was Magic.
Magic. Can you explain a little bit about what, is it classified, by the way?
No, not now.
Not classified. Can you explain what this Magic is or was?
My understanding, it was the diplomatic level communications, high level communications. So if it was diplomatic, then that would be embassy to embassy and provide instructions from their foreign ministry out to the different embassies and so forth. So, for example, for Pearl Harbor, we weren't able to get into the Japanese communications as quickly as possible, as needed, and we almost got there. We were intercepting it, we were decoding it, and we just didn't get the information in the right place at the right time to prevent Pearl Harbor. But we were actually decoding the information faster than the Japanese were.
And that was Magic.
And that was Magic,
Then
I believe, yeah.
How does Purple fit in?
Purple was a system that they used to identify what encryption system was being used. And Magic, I think, was more of the classification of the higher level codes being used. But you had Purple and you had several others that were being used throughout the war. The Japanese would change it up every now and then and modify it. But Purple was the initial part that they looked at. In fact, one of your friends, Al Layton, was one of the early folks who were going after and intercepting the Japanese communications. He arrived in Hawaii probably about 1937 and was stationed at Fort Shafter with the Night Signal Company. And they had a little hut that they operated out of. One half was for photography, and they were in the back room. And he was given a choice of whether to go up to the War Department radio station up by the parade field at Fort Shafter, or go down in this little gully that they had with this little building in it and go to the back room. And in the back room, even though it was super secret, they had screened windows and people walking by might see what they or hear what they were doing, but they were in there intercepting Japanese communications.
Which leads me to chat with you about the locations of our intercept facilities. You mentioned Hawaii. We also had one out in California, which was called Turok. We had one in Alaska, and I think you mentioned that we also had one in India.
We had some in India as well. Now they were probably supporting the activities in China and Burma, but they did share information as far as if they broke into a Japanese code, and that was part of the success in the Southwest Pacific, was information from that area.
All of these facilities had a direct line to Arlington Hall.
They appeared to have some communications. The direction finding net towards the end of the war was all across the Pacific. One operator in the 119th, who was in Hawaii, off the North Shore, his location was basically tied into where he would listen for the Japanese communication. He would tip off the other stations on the network, and when the Japanese were speaking and talking, he wouldn't do anything, but in the gaps he would hold down a key, so they would just get, the other stations would get a tone in their headsets. And so those stations would identify that they've had the right frequency, the right target, and then they would start shooting their azimuths to the target, and they would all come to this person or this site in Hawaii. They would put it on a plotting table, figure out where all the azimuths lined up, the lines of bearing lined up, and where they intersect was pretty much where the target was.
Really?
But that ranged from the Aleutians all the way down around to the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. And as you mentioned earlier, as we did the island hopping across the Pacific, we would have positions in Guam, we would have positions in the Philippines, Iwo Jima towards the end of the war.
The Marines, as they island hopped, did they have intelligence units island hop with them?
I'm sure they did. I'm not sure how much they worked, how much they had organic to the Marines. They may have relied upon the Navy quite a bit.
I think it may have been the Navy. Of course, they had their wind talkers, as we know, the Indian, which I thought was amazing. The way the Indians learned the war terminology, transferred into their language, and I know the Japanese were totally befuddled.
Completely.
That was outstanding. But getting back to MacArthur, when he received this information, did his G2 or his military intelligence personnel decrypt it and send it back information to Arlington Hall, or did he have a decrypting capability?
I think with the IBM machines that Charles Gerhardt had, I think the key punch machines helped them decrypt information in the field.
So then he obviously also had lines of communication down to the 126?
Yes, yes.
And the 126 would pass it on to the supporting general officer, whoever it was. Is this correct?
There may have been a relationship there. Definitely came back to MacArthur and the Central Bureau that was established there in Australia and then moved with him. I'm not sure how they were sharing information out with the corps or the divisions that were out there on the islands.
See, I keep thinking about Europe and how the low-level voice intercept got directly to the commander.
Exactly.
Or to his G2, whatever he wished. And I'm trying to then compare what was on the east to what's being done in the South Pacific.
Definitely a different environment.
One of the little things I remember in my experience was in copying, I was copying a Tokyo to Saigon link, and this was toward the end of the war. And the Tokyo was changing its system. And he started sending a message to Saigon. And in my words, Saigon said, wait a minute, I don't know what you're sending. So this went back and forth until finally Tokyo said in Q signals, okay, here's the comparison of the old and the new. So as I'm copying, I raised my hand. And the traffic analyst rushed in, and as soon as I finished that old and new code comparison,
Yep.
he ripped it off and went back to Arlington Hall. I think that was one of the things that I do remember. Another thing I remember is how the Japanese operators pulled rank. Again, I was copying Tokyo, and he was talking to an outstation, and they were back and forth. I have one message, and the other one outdid it. I have two, and no, I have three. Finally, Tokyo said, I'm a first lieutenant. And the other one said, okay, you go ahead and send your traffic. All of this was in Q signals, which was the language of the day as far as the intercept operator was concerned. Do you recall any familiar?
Well, you have international Q and Z signals that, for Morse code, everybody uses. And there might be changes in how the military might use it, but in general, everybody had Q and Z signals. And they would basically start off even testing out the signal strength. You know, can you hear me? And you would respond back that you can, and what the signal strength was, and so that type of coordination before you send your message is all critical, because that's pretty much out in the open, and that's where you're picking up the call signs and message numbers, and then they start getting into the actual preamble of the message and the body of the message, and so very important to pick those up.
One of the things I remember is that when I learned Katakana, and the fact that we had to copy this, we had to type at twice the speed of normal, because, as an example, in Japanese, "Jotomate kudasai" is just a minute, please. Well, the radio operators that asked for a wait would say "mate," so we had to type "mate," whereas over in the German or in the European theater it was "as," which is wait.
Yep.
Something like, which is just two characters. So we had to type, as I said, twice the speed when copying these Japanese operators as they sent. So it was a little difficult.
Yep. Different procedures.
We did it,
Yep.
all of us.
Oh, good.
I'm thinking back at Midway and the tremendous system that we used. Rochefort was the key, and he's the one that went to Admiral Nimitz.
Oh, well, Leighton was his intelligence officer. Admiral Leighton was his
but
intelligence.
It was Rochefort who was the one that suggested
Exactly.
the border.
Exactly.
And the reason why we were so successful was because the Japanese fleet, Admiral Nugamo particularly, had armed his fleet to bomb Midway. And when he learned that there was some fleet airplanes in the air, then he wanted to change over to torpedoes. He said the Navy is here somewhere. So the Japanese seamen changing bombs to torpedoes, he just took the torpedo or the bombs and just threw them to the side, attaching torpedoes. Here we come with our attack bombers from the Navy 2 carriers and decimated the tremendous fleet that the Japanese had going down the Midway. So this was an intelligence coup beyond words. And
Definite
I'm
turning
sure
point.
there were also within the Army complex similar stories of how the Army intelligence or the intelligence people really supported our troops in the field.
Well, I think the one that you pointed out with Yamamoto was definitely one of the critical ones. So you'd have the Army Air Corps respond to that with the P-38 flights and shoot him down. So that, I think, was probably our equivalent to Midway from an Army perspective. The transportation code, water transportation code, provided information, in some cases enabled the Navy to go sink transports and take out convoys, and that was key. And as a minimum, allowed the armies to, MacArthur and Nimitz, to find out where the Japanese were putting their troops, and then whether they wanted to attack the islands or just bypass them and let the island garrison starve. that was important to do.
Getting into Navy intelligence for a moment, remember the famous case of the sinking of the Indianapolis by Japanese submarine U-5? Did intelligence fail us?
I don't know that intelligence failed us in that case. There was probably, if I understand the scenario, with Indianapolis not zigzagging, and it was probably more of a case of you had a Japanese submarine that was out there that may or may not have been detected and specifically pinpointed, but towards the end of the war, then people were maybe a little more too overconfident, and that resulted in the sinking of the Indianapolis.
Well, I'm thinking during the trial, the actual Japanese commander of that submarine appeared, and he said in testimony that the zigzagging would not have made any difference. He was going to get it. But yet the Navy did court-martial didn't court-martial him. I can't think of the word to use right now, but the commander, the captain of the ship, was relieved of his command, and in naval terms, he was kind of ostracized.
Yep.
And he later committed suicide. But I was just wondering how intelligence involved in that particular case. I do know that for 3 days, Philippines did not know of any particular arrival of the Indianapolis. They were not aware. So wherever the Indianapolis departed from, I would think would be rather remiss in not indicating when the Indianapolis departed, where it was headed to, things like this.
Oh, I would agree.
So really, we have come to the conclusion that it wasn't intelligence that really was.
I'm not aware of anything. Yeah, not with the Indianapolis.
Well, switching over to India for a moment, you mentioned about we had some troops or facilities. Did they have access to a communication link between them and Arlington Hall?
I don't know if they had a direct communication. I'm sure that they had one that they could route to get information to Arlington Hall. Information was definitely shared between the China, Burma, India theater and the Pacific and Arlington Hall. And going back to the Japanese analysts so that they could put all the information together and try to make sense out of it, and then they would provide technical information out to the units in the field.
Did the Japanese use one-time pads?
They may have, very likely. I mean, that was a common technique, very challenging to get into. You get one shot at it, but unless you know how that one-time pad was created, very, very unlikely that you're going to be able to solve it. And that's where the traffic analysis comes in. Even though you're using a one-time pad, you're still providing a call sign. You're still maybe a schedule and a frequency that you're using that's trackable. So you leave a fingerprint.
I also think, and I remember, where the operator could help the analyst by recognizing a fist or adding some comments as to what the operator has observed in this exchange of traffic. So there was a rapport between the operator, the traffic analyst, and maybe further on up.
Exactly. All that came together. It was definitely a lot of luck involved, a lot of skill, and a lot of art.
I think the bottom line, Bob, is that intelligence in the Pacific as well as in Europe succeeded in supporting the commander.
Definitely. I would agree so.
And with that, Bob, I'm going to say thank you for coming all the way from Denver to
My
be
pleasure.
here with us today. The information that you imparted has been outstanding, and I thank you very much
you,
for
Bob.
coming. And now we thank the viewer for staying with us. We hope that we have imparted some past history in reference to intelligence. Bob Zykowitz, on the part of Bob Peterson, bidding you a good day and have a great day and stay healthy.